Hello,
everyone. So today's topic is going to be mainly about suffering, and also I'm going to explain about what kind of methods are being presented in the Buddhism in order to face and handle these situations of suffering. So the Buddha Shakyamuni, after he reached enlightenment, it's been like 64 days, only 64 days after Buddha reached enlightenment, he started teaching. So there is a quote which I cannot repeat accurately, but basically it means that the Buddha has said that since the Dharma and the teaching that he found is very, very profound, like the nectar of the gods. So, and it will be also very, very difficult for other people to understand its meaning. So therefore, I'll stay in the woods for the time being. And after 64 days, so only then the Buddha started teaching, and his first disciples were the five excellent retinue. This is like the name, so they were like his first five disciples, and then he first started teaching them because he saw that they are suitable for receiving his teachings, and he taught them at first the presentation of the Four Noble Truths at Varanasi. So at first, with regards to the presentation of the Four Noble Truths, at first Buddha taught the truth of suffering in order to at first identifying the suffering itself. And then Buddha taught the truth of origin in the context of to search and explore whether there is a cause for the suffering or not, and whether it is possible to remove the cause for the suffering or not. So this was in the context of the truth of origin. And then Buddha taught the truth of cessation, which then he explained which then he kind of presented that whether it's possible or impossible to reach the cessation of the suffering. And then he explained about the truth of the path, which is explaining how to reach the truth of cessation of the suffering. And Buddhism is being main. It's the core of Buddhism. We can say that this is the presentation of the Four Noble Truths.
Damek Tarak Namzarema, or any that long ago, and it was also that. Than that there's a quarrel so much interest.
And also within the Buddhism, there are different kind of systems and philosophical schools, and they are merely being differentiated by means of the presentation of the subtleties and gross levels of the view of the selflessness, but with regards to the practice of that path, such as the Four Noble Truths, so it is in common within all the philosophical schools.
That Homer and Dinger Dembason, the Zambalata, Daja Tembagi, Natsuk Soniki, Ronges and Amadon, the Karazana, and Dingoyamba, so we consult Tomshed, the Dingoy Roger, but she go back catching both things.
So at first, the Buddha has taught the truth of the suffering. And in the truth of the suffering, Buddha has taught that the basic nature of our lives is of the nature of suffering. And all the abundance and the enjoyments that we have in our life, actually, they are in the nature of suffering. And since this is something which is very, very important to recognize, Buddha has taught this first.
Oh, Tinda Dingo, the Tony Jason, Zani Meba Zoala, and Yemutu something Pongubat and retain this.
And Buddha has taught that in order to remove the suffering from its root, so we need to abandon what is called the three poisons. We need to remove what we call the three poisons.
Oh, Tinda Yemutu the Pombalayon, and Damet of Shira Gomba at the Druguba, Damet of Shira and the Druguba and Songless.
And in order to remove the three poisons, which are the main afflictions, so Buddha has taught that at first one should realize the selflessness.
Oh, that is, I danger drums and I'm that number so you be chuk drums about it and you or today, yes.
And we can say that this is that the presentation of the Four Noble Truths is kind of the framework of the Buddhism.
Angazo ani dikal amni mombosing mugaji teri dunga jetabi kape nangazo namjeng lik nazik the song dinga zam duam chazo le yodya ke ani teri ngazo asawel ndibi teri kangal joa yongaras kangal.
And I don't need to elaborate much more about this topic, and we can also just look about specific cases of suffering that we have in our life, such as physical pain or a mental suffering. This is something which is in common with all of us, right? And this kind of suffering, sometimes they can be unimaginable in terms of their intensity and their difficulties.
Ati ani pena don't draw nduk koni join tanda kisa kutamiza pomochila mola ani pu ji ani korog pu pa hajo Gia Jitija the Puji, Annie Yamaji Nani, Annie Tony, Kolaba, something about the Mozua and the Dingonyo is a responsible.
And there is one story from the Sutra, and which is about a woman, her name is Kisakotama. And this woman, she had a child, and her child was sick, and eventually he had to die. And the woman, his mother, so she experienced like very, very intense suffering and pain.
Ani Tama de Ko Ani Sonji Sama Ani Drone, Sonji Lani to Jizumi Pote, Ani Saint of Ju, younger than Ani Yaju Saves.
And then this woman went to the Buddha himself, and she asked him whether there is any kind of method or way to make my child alive again.
Ani Sonji, Ani younger, Ani Dimas the Buddha Yas, Saint of younger, Ani Choro younger in Druchi, Ani Barmuko, Ani Zimbasani, Tinishoda, Ani Kotashi Negres in the Risondres.
And then the Buddha said that there is such a method, and what she needs to do is that she needs to go and to find a seed of mustard and to give it to the Buddha in a bowl.
Ani Titonyam Chaki Karaterezana, Kiron, Ani Mujembasani, Londu Saki, Maso Tesola, 아니 미 서포 시마뇽 게들이 지금 무슨 지사니 아니 비 용거 근저 랭고라즈들이 아니 찾게 되어서
But what kind of condition should be completed when you give the seed of mustard? So the Buddha said that you should also take this seed of mustard from a family in which no one has ever died.
덴로티 삼발라 아니 다나 보면되게 고 아니 용거 그들을 하버지니 아니 땡게 레디 예나이 뭐 소마기 아니 거쳐놓라 지신요 아니 베나 발라신요 말라신요 아니 벤자레 가르레 아니 보고모모 직신용 개조조마도 아니 마신게 지조 아니 산이 라유 마레스.
And then at first this woman, she thought that it would be very, very easy just to find a seed of mustard and giving it to the Buddha. But then after she started searching and going like to different kind of houses, so she found out that there is no kind of place in which the mother, the father, like the siblings, the grandfather, the grandmother has not died.
어디서 아니 다 타마들 못 가르쳐서나 다 아니 접다게 되는 용사대 아니 콘치브레 만도와 무젠바이 도와서니 그런 그 삼루라 아니 요가 되어서 다 되는 친구들 아니 용으로 동하게 마들이 아니 들이 종이 그래서.
And then after understanding that the suffering of the death, this is not something which is only she experiences, but this is something which is in common with a lot of other people. So it is said that her mental suffering and her problem, just its intensity decreased.
다들 나서 스스 다들 또딘 서비스 가디 아니 몰라 아니 담라 나서지 지 당가 자마시아 그들이 가디 용구 사레스
Danke, Mashe.
담라 choice no choice 그거라
나도 danke, Mashe.
다들 용구 사레스 아 dinner 타고들이 뭐
And sometimes there is type of suffering which we experience because of having like a lot of options and not knowing what to choose.
그래서 안에 디라이스 강할 때 안에 서라 안에 탑시 가르요르자 디 안에 베나 강할 때 설타고래도 말해자 띵골 티도 요르스 강할 때
Doctor Mepate.
독터 매바로 아니 강할 때 설타 매바지 너나 가르쳐 버려자 줘라
Yes, and so I think that I mistranslated something. I think that it was just like the meaning of that we experience a lot of suffering and problems, and then we may have like this kind of thinking that maybe it's not possible to remove this kind of problems and suffering. And then we may ask ourselves in this kind of situation while having this idea in our mind, like what we should do then.
강할 때 설타 매바지도 안에 주로 안에 되나요? 될라 안에 나서 열타 문제니 안에 태걸 안에 농래지 거한테 개침부 이사랬어.
And we may think that our problems in our life, this is something which is irremovable. Still, it will be very, very good if we'll be able just to face our problems directly and to try to handle them directly without ignoring them.
배낭아서 뭐 소말로 스스 긴고 차도 안에 신도아 그 만데게 소마 만데게 쪼쪼래디요 연낭아서 이발도 때 안에 딜이 열터 요 말했어.
Because all of us, we are going to experience the suffering of aging and death and so forth, but still we should not ignore it.
다들 안에 내가 요 말해라 안에 딜이 안에 열터지 연나에 때 제터지 요래디 연나에 되게 펜도 게요 말했어.
So though sometimes you try to ignore this kind of problems and try to forget them, still this is not something which is very helpful.
거기 가서 내가 대다 용할라 아니 대답 좀 어디 삼발라 딜이 열터고 쳇다 아니 가서 전에도 dra가서라 dra가도 아니 총도 들이 보니 아니 내가 그래서 열터지 요랬어.
So sometimes in order to kind of ignore or to forget about the problems that we have in our life, what we do is that we try to distract ourselves by drinking alcohol and consuming these kind of things.
얘는 디근 타말라 안에 디근 nemba야 zon다지마 또 안에 페토시라 용기 사마레스.
But eventually what's happening is that we are just adding problems above the problems that we already have, and other than that, it's not like it's going to be very beneficial for us.
다기 안에 등을들이 조토메바 페나가서 쳐와도 안에 기기 등을서 레온티 잠발로 뜻소나 안에 동네제나 가르펜도 요래라 주라 수술을 가르키페 요래자 어디고티도 요래스.
And then we may ask, like, what will be the benefit of trying to face or to try to handle or to solve these problems by facing them directly, such as the problems of death and aging, which are not something which is removable, right?
페나 교롭게 등에 뜻소 걸로 안에 페나 쳐와도 안에 등을 뜻소 걸로 열탑 제바도 여마 뜻소 제탑 제나 제마 카드 때래 어디 sambal라 교로 핸터도 봐 등을 침부 용하게 아니 디 견종이었어.
So with regards to this kind of problems, such as aging, death, and so forth, if we'll try just to forget it and to ignore it, so eventually at the day when we'll have to face these kind of problems, we won't be ready, and then we'll be very, very surprised, and these kind of problems will become very, very intense and big in our mind.
선살로 가시로 안에 조못하게 등을 종구였어.
And also sometimes people experience this kind of problems without being able to bear because of its intensity.
제전 결혼기 안에 뜻속을 섬로 도저도 안에 쳐와도 나오지 치기봐도 안에 지 안에 가그 등을 뜻속을 도저 서로 돈사회나 결혼을 안에 대다 강을 때 무슨 최어디 잠발라 수수 뽑아한다고 지도 안에 롱스기 된 바던데 인룰을 자주와 이장 수수 지 안에 롱스기 셔 말했어.
And if we'll try to reflect on these problems in advance, such as the problems of aging and death and so forth, and we'll try to reflect and think about them, so at the time when we'll actually have to experience this kind of problems, so we'll have some kind of confidence and we won't lose our self-control because we did some kind of preparations in advance.
And I 결혼 등어도 안에 동네 제토나 결혼을 무슨 때 최어디 잠발라 수술을 자주 안서 있자 아니 지 년주 자주로 안서 요아 있자 아니 지 섭헬번에 안에 데이터가 니통시 용거랬어.
And if we'll actually try to face this kind of problems and to handle them and to try to solve them, so at the time when we'll be actually have to face this kind of problems, we'll be very ready, and then at this time we can be in such a situation when our mind will be very relaxed and calm.
그나가서 안에 마존지야 때 비자네시나 나서 안에 마존지야 고무드 카르베스나 파키야 아여살 조어디 잠발라 아니 아타드 안사면이 요아게 아니 다드지야 그래서 콜 마존데 메소나 아여살 무슨 조디 파키니 다시야도 아니 본다고 던지다보다 시오디 잠발라
And we can give an example of military training. So if someone, before he's going to war, so he's doing a lot of preparations and doing a lot of kind of military training and exercises. So at the time when he'll have to go to war, so he'll be very ready and it won't be a problem for him to do all the things which are needed in war. But if someone is not coming ready, so at the time when he'll get into the situation of war, so he won't know how to shoot or how to throw bombs and so forth, and he'll be in a very, very difficult situation, right?
암지기 콜라 안에 게라 결혼 캔서 차서 그제디고 나서 나오듯사 아니 저번 나가 논다 동라 안에 남자지 때 그래서 지금 안에 파 그로 안에 도저야 야부차서 그라 저로 야부차기 되지 아스마도 지금 안에 동 남자지 때 그래서 안에 들이 수수 가르자 롱스 템포로 들이 데이터하게 기베의 연구를 살았어.
So in the same way, we can also give some examples which resembles this kind of previous example that we gave of Buddhist practitioners. So there is one kind of a teacher or an elder monk, and he used to think about the suffering of death and the situation of death a lot and to reflect about it many times. And then one day he went to the doctor, and the doctor told him that he has a cancer. And then this elder monk just said, okay, no problem. And he had like just kind of a very usual kind of expression of face, facial expression, and didn't look like anything kind of unusual or something like this. And then a bit later, he went to the doctor once again, and the doctor told him that you don't have cancer, so you're cured from the cancer. And then he just said, okay, no problem, without making any kind of a special facial expression. So this is the kind of benefit of reflecting about these problems in advance, and at the time of actually experiencing them, being able to keep a certain level of self-control.
항아서 아니 기디 잠바네 아니 즈폰도 집안 당 지탱 그 평소에 차선데 자치지 뭐서서 등을 그지만라고 지 차든자 아니 다 등을 연구하되 다 땡키서레스 마 기디 잠반
기뻐요.
마 기바로 아 기차와
알레켄.
기차.
So just once one has got born, since the nature of this body is a contaminated one, and this body is actually the basis of the suffering, so we are destined to experience a lot of problems and suffering.
딘데 등을 그저사인 바든 문제 톱소나 아니 수수 등을 대뇨 구데메 냐네 아니 날 가리치는 날 등을 대용레자도 아니 수수 코라지아도 아니 아마 날 아니 나치불 레서 냐비 드리키 아니 수수 코라지아도 요리토와 그 쳐버요레스.
And if we'll be able to identify that this is the kind of the basis or the root of the suffering, what we just explained. So this kind of thoughts of like, why do I have to experience this suffering, or why does it happen to me, or to blame like everything around me and thinking that why does it happen only to me, why I need to experience this kind of problem. So all these kind of thoughts will be reduced.
아니 아마들 가르르스나 다나 카식 로우다 넘바 상지비 추데 아니 교노레르레스 등의 초경경시 아니 뭐솔라 아니 세노기야도 아니 강남 퍼마트야스마도 아니 이게지 기벤즈 남들다 아니 들이 지금문도스 들이 신케요레스.
And also there are some people that say that Buddhism is actually just kind of a doctrine of pessimism, because actually it's only talking on the direction of suffering and only saying like bad things and only kind of adding problems above the problems that we already have, and there is actually no benefit of this kind of theory.
네 안에 오니 초진이 삼도나 그래서 등어에서 서터맨이 동네지하고 탑시다지면아 교노를 모니데 차그레스.
And if we think from one direction, if these kind of problems are actually irremovable, something that we cannot actually solve, so just to explain and talk a lot about suffering, this is something which is become actually a bit like that, right?
아니 이나에 넘바 상지비 추로 다기가 해야 년 시바 논쟁기 아니 렌식이 나오자도 아니 넘기 그리 나오자도서 고로 점수도 들리지고라 아니 러시 자오디 삼발라 다다 바기지 아니 등어도 소리 드라그 탑시지 아니 대용서자 아니 교노rel리를 대인도스.
But the Buddhism, and more specifically its main teaching, the presentation of the Four Noble Truths, the presentation of practicing the path. This kind of framework is actually presenting ways of being free from suffering. So therefore, I don't see it as a kind of just a doctrine of pessimism.
다들 안에 들리지는 섭자니 안에 좋아요 나눠봐 좋았다는 데서.
So now we can just stop here with regards to the kind of the main teaching. And now if you have a question, so we can have kind of a Q&A session. Den Shinan kera den pachi ni mato correlação mação. Ani chesa ta den pa lagmate to kareles.
And then lama de da ani jitondo ani goden sa to lamde sa ta yores yana ngi kos baba ta zu de ani ta moncha jiton dinga cheta be kalos sia iza ani to so shi gu mare sam ani dijay ma ta jitondo dinga gobin gobaza ani ko bagi tarbi kompo ta wodi zambala dinga dongle ja goba ta diji ani kompo ji ta yores de tawala lamde lamzena da zu dame toba to so ani in rugwa gnazaji ani three yores.
So apart from the first two noble truths which I presented, there are also the truth of the cessation and truth of the path. But since this kind of a class engaged mainly in specific cases of suffering, so I didn't elaborate about these types of truth very much. But with regards to the truth of cessation, it is explaining the possibility of being released from the suffering by abandoning its cause and therefore achieving liberation. And in order to achieve liberation, what needs to precede it is the realization of the selflessness, and this is being indicated in the truth of path.
Music drama dana tagi di ani naso Geshe Phuntsok la ta jiton party na ani dikin da buji yore ma to yana yo ta putsini sona kola ani dingo rojin yimbate diro myeshi binjik to la ani peki senyer ko akara chimbo village de la dikin de chi yores.
So if there are no specific questions, I would like to talk about one quote of a very high scholar of Buddhism of the 20th century, which is called Gendon Chopel. And in one of his quotes, so he says that though when seeing the abundance and the enjoyment of the world, like it seems like of a very, very happy nature, actually when experiencing it or actually when achieving these kind of things, so we can understand that they are actually in the nature of suffering.
Tindri ane patina kendo kabu Geshe Phuntsok so zabjik ngaso diware kar longkya ke yonzo de patina kendo kabu yore de yana yo ta su kabu ke ane deso tapso na yo gauri deso la seno kya to dinga kya tandi yongures de jezan digi ane de pe debuchi tsaso se tanda di.
So it is basically said that though things may be seen like very, very pleasant and joyful from the outside, like all the different enjoyments and abundance of the world that can offer, so actually when once achieving them, we understand that actually these kind of things may create even more problems for us, and they are actually of the nature of suffering. So I found this kind of quote very, very good and wise, so therefore I wanted to share it with you.
Because it is so tough, so now I need daily months time now. I mean, depi Deba Makani, Yonjo Tamnasan, Dina. Kari Matana, Yon de Tapsana and the Matawa Tapsana and the Oh, that dinner de three Deba Matsa, the Dramata when in Jogus arrest.
And also sometimes we may have this kind of problems which are created from wanting to achieve even more things, though we already achieved something. So though we already, for example, achieved like what we wanted, when we have it, so still by not being able to satisfy our desire, we are still pursuing and wanting to gain other things. And when we don't have these things, so we have like this kind of, when we don't gain like the things that we wanted from the start, we don't gain nothing. So then we have like this kind of thoughts of, oh, how wonderful it will be if I'll have this kind of things that I want to achieve and so forth. So we have a lot of kind of problems and suffering which are derived from this kind of not being able to satisfy our desires. Okay, so this is what I wanted to say, and other than that, if you have questions, so please feel comfortable to ask.
According to Buddhism, how does suffering arise?
Nang la tene, ta dungel, jungtante, kante dapo sigres, dungel kare la tene dungel chungires.
That's also the Annie non Generation, do some Genemus Ajura. Telateni, Annie Yongus arrest.
So if I'm explaining according to Buddhism, the suffering arises based on the three poisons, which are like three types of afflictions. So basically it says that the desire, the hatred or anger, and the ignorance are these kind of three afflictions are just like poison. But if we are talking from the perspective of the Tantra system in Buddhism, so there is also a kind of explanation which says that the attachment or the desire, this is a necessary kind of thing that we need to employ in order to reach the state of Buddhahood. But actually this kind of explanation of kind of turning the attachment or desire into the path of practicing, this is something which is mainly relevant for very, very high practitioners, and otherwise this is not something which is easy to practice or to employ. And with regards to the shortcomings as we presented, such as the three poisons, so these things are dependent, or their core is what we call the self-grasping ignorance. And what does it mean, the self-grasping? The self-grasping is this kind of grasping at a self which doesn't depend on anyone else and can stand by its own self-sufficiently. And if we are talking about the world, if we are looking around the world, we can see that even the Buddha himself, he reached Buddhahood only by being dependent on other sentient beings, if we are talking from the perspective of phenomena which are dependent on each other, which are being established by means of interdependency.
단 딘다 츠톱 줘봐서단 수수 롱켜와 슬라마테 번제 어디 잠발라 나저때 슈클레이르스 anga pa bete ngali tatsne ani somni pa jinla ani cheseja so yong usares.
And if we have this kind of grasping at the self which doesn't depend on anyone else and can stand alone self-sufficiently, so from this kind of grasping, the pride and the haughtiness are coming. And by having this kind of attitude, we think that, oh, there is no one who is better than me. I can do everything by my own. And then we also disregard others and look down on them.
Tido nyamda ani ta susu luto motoage ani chapalo dio nyamda tong usares.
Yeah, Yoshi?
Susu lu motoa jura susu ki ani ngali tatsne tengyora da naja jewo de sambala tido nyamda susu lu motongi ani ta debalo jura susu pa chiti haju chimbo jewo de chapati ni mongle usares ronshiki. 딘다이 다 나저트 되더라. 나 스콘라 아니 신고하면 나 스콘라 두고야면 근데 다 나저트 내 어디서나 다 수술을 아니 뼈부지 수술은 다 잡아 수술이 요새를 잡았대.
And then by having this kind of attitude of pride and haughtiness, so then we develop this kind of attitude of attachment, which we are very, very attached or have a great, great desire for the things that we possess and we have.
다 띠니냠도 다 아니 다기 득성근원이 드무자 다 띠니냠도 요요한다 지라서 가디나.
And with regards to these two things, the attachment and the pride, so the ignorance, the one among the three poisons, so it is always accompanying these two.
근데 지사랬더니
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
So my question is, so if there is a lot of suffering and we talked about the cause of suffering, so what we need to do, what is the way to liberate ourselves from suffering? Like what can we practice in order to liberate ourselves from these problems? Ta perna dungel den pa tan kunjun den pa gen lagi ta dis shebain pa. Ani chesan ta dungel tendre yo paina ten ngatso nyamlen kare chene tan ngatso dungel tele chol tu gire ngatso nyamlen kare che gore ta dungel mang po reina ngatso
다 베테 자와니 메바 zuala taki danzete 아니 메바 마스나 용니 종구 사레스 데나스.
So in order to eliminate or to abandon the suffering from its core, from its root, actually we need to abandon at first what we call the self-grasping. And if we won't be able to abandon this kind of attitude, so we'll have to experience suffering again and again.
다연 등을 제다받아서 메바스자라 니카렐라 아니 야 뭔더만요라 탐시 아니 다지 뒤서 뭐부시야도 아바디 지구 종만가다 아니 젠바트 다르니지 연스스 그데마드 연타자 아들이 탐시 담다요 사레스 그마 제다비 걸메 바디시나.
But if we are talking just about specific cases of suffering, so in order to not to experience this kind of suffering being manifested, like temporarily, so there are different kind of methods that we can apply, such as practicing of breathing, and also trying to compare our situation with others, so we can gain some kind of proportion about our situation. So if we don't have any other questions, so we can just finish this session. Thank you very much.